Oh, wander over yonder, my beloved. From my reviews and riffs to my WOIMVs to the way I weave references to it into my animation to those incredibly specific Yu-Gi-Oh decks portrayed by WOI clips, it's no secret that this show is incredibly special to me. I really wanted to talk about the show again, but I wanted to be something more interesting with some real substance behind it, rather than me just making cutesy one-liners and perverted jokes and shilling my own animations. Now, it's important that I preface this by saying I am not dunking on any of the other shows I bring up in this video, and in fact, I enjoy the way they tell their stories and how they present their characters. They are some of the best shows and characters in all of animation, but Wander Over Yonder is just a show I put on a pedestal, doubly so because of its cruel fate and lack of discussion about it, and I just want to make sure that flame never dies out, even nearly a decade later. For those who are unaware, which is probably way more people than I wish, Wander Over Yonder is a 2013 Disney cartoon created by Craig McCracken about an idealistic, upbeat guy named Wander and his tough-as-nails steed and bestie Sylvia, traveling a colorful galaxy to explore new worlds, help out folks in need, and Bugs Bunny the hell out of villains. In particular, Lord Hater, his right-hand man Commander Peepers, and their army of watchdogs that the titular duo managed to take them from being one of the greatest evils in the galaxy to a bunch of chumps. All of this is in an effort to not only save the galaxy's inhabitants from their reign, but to also ultimately redeem and befriend them when all is said and done. The show is incredibly funny with lovable characters and is ultimately one of the most wholesome cartoons to ever exist outside of ones aimed at little kids. However, you're probably now thinking to yourself, Vex, how in the actual hell is this Looney Tunes Star Wars shit better at telling big dramatic stories than basically any cartoon that even attempts to do so? Well, to answer that, I first have to talk about how the 2010s led to an evolution of the entire medium of non-superhero cartoons as a whole. Why do I have to clarify it like that? Well, because superhero cartoons have been doing these kinds of stories practically since day one. The rest of the genres of cartoons just had to figure out a way to play catch-up. And hell, even then, that also isn't new. There are examples of non-superhero cartoons doing this too, such as Samurai Jack or Danny Phantom. They weaved a serialized story into an episodic show, but this type of storytelling, and in particular this take a silly show and suddenly make it big and dramatic curveball tactic, didn't really take off like a rocket until the 2010s. So what led to all this? Well, I think it can be tied to two cartoons in particular. Adventure Time and Gravity Falls. Now you might be saying, Vex, you're forgetting about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Atla, I think, is a very special case, and I'd categorize it in the same folder as Samurai Jack and the like. It was Nick's attempt at riding the anime train, and since most of the widely popular anime tell those types of serialized stories in some shape or form, Atla was allowed to take that approach too. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, but if anime was completely taken out of the equation, I doubt Nick would let Atla tell the story it wanted to tell, since it was, and still is, very different from the rest of the channel's catalog. Now let's start with Adventure Time. It was 2010 and this silly little show about a boy and his magic dog in this weird world going on journeys and fighting monsters. It was very creative and super different than other cartoons at the time, and it would go on to be one of Cartoon Network's flagship shows of the 2010s. The first two seasons were fairly lighthearted, and someone once described it as a D&D campaign played by drunken frat boys. But then the season 2 finale came and changed everything. It introduced the Lich, a terrifying force of destruction that looks like a decaying sorcerer, has a deep intimidating voice, and powers of necromancy. Oh, and he's not funny at all. He's portrayed completely seriously, and even when it seems like he's defeated, the episode ends with his spirit possessing a waving snail, who up until that point was just an Easter egg. the Lich ended up being incredibly popular since he clashed with everything else in the show so much, and this led to Adventure Time evolving into a more serialized and dramatic show, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. This was the show that made general audiences realize that non-superhero cartoons could be much bigger than episodic comedies. Now, while Adventure Time planted the seeds for serialized stories, Gravity Falls distributed the crop since it was an insanely popular show that still gets discussed to this day. Now, Gravity Falls I wouldn't actually categorize in the same folder as Adventure Time and Wander Over Yonder, because while it started out as episodic and lighthearted, looking a little closer showed that it was headed somewhere. Due to the whole mystery element and all those secret codes and blink and you'll miss it foreshadowing, it made itself clear from day one that there was a bigger thing brewing beneath the show's surface. The main villain himself even shows up at the very end of the theme song, even though he doesn't even appear until the season finale, proving he wasn't just thought up in the middle of things like the Lich was. The rest is history. With Gravity Falls being a rousing success, more cartoons started to follow in its footsteps, with a lighthearted show weaving in bigger and more intense stories throughout. This is especially the case with Disney cartoons, since they shared a network with Gravity Falls. Now just about every new one has lore and drama in there somewhere. I think the only post-Gravity Falls non-serialized Disney shows are Big City Greens and The Ghost and Molly McGee. Some do it really well, like Amphibia. Some do it okay, like the DuckTales reboot, and some fucking crash and burn to the point where all discussion and content related to them has become non-existent, such as Star versus the Forces of Evil. Seriously, when was the last time you've seen that show even mentioned in passing before now? Now, Wander Over Yonder only half fits this, as its first season premiered around the same time the first season of Gravity Falls was airing. It may have not been until season 2 where the show got serialized, but Craig actually wanted it to be just like that from the beginning. Wander and Sylvia were intended to having just met in the first episode and become BFFs by the season's end. However, Disney said they had to be friends from the get-go, but you can see remnants of the duo being more distant with each other in earlier episodes. In particular, the egg. Disney and Craig were able to reach a compromise in season 2, where it could be partly serialized with 4 two-parter episodes breaking up the season into 3 acts, and the crew even credits the success of Gravity Falls itself as a factor in allowing them to do this. Now, what exactly happens in season 2 that makes things all serialized suddenly? 2 words. Lord Dominator. Lord Dominator was introduced to throw the silly show for a loop by bringing in this big, scary, serious villain. Lord Dominator is hyper-competent, powerful, and makes all the show's previous villains look like nothing, especially Lord Hater. But Vex, you might say, how is that any different than the Lich, Bellows, and the Diamonds? They all serve the same narrative purpose, so why are you putting Wander on a pedestal like this? Well, it's very simple. It doesn't abandon its silly roots. With other cartoons, when they shift to serialized stories, they stop being silly and basically become a totally different cartoon. Wander Over Yonder, on the other hand, while it may have its dark and serious moments when it needs to, it still remains a wholesome Looney Tunes-like space show. Defying the approach to storytelling that other cartoons do was the WOY crew's goal for season 2. They wanted to prove that you can have big dramatic stories in a goofy cartoon without having to abandon its core identity. The only cartoon that even attempted to tell serialized stories this way is Amphibia, and that came out after WOY ended. Going back to Lord Dominator, even she ends up being more in line with the show's atmosphere because it turns out all that seriousness and scariness is a literal mask. Beneath that armor is a frog woman who is just as much of a goofy dork as everyone else in the show. Just one who is very fucked up in the head and good at her job. It's a complete bait and switch of the typical scary serialized antagonist. Dominator is essentially a living allegory of the Wander Over Yonder crew's storytelling philosophy. Really, on a bigger level, Lord Dominator feels like an allegory for the 2010s era of cartoon storytelling as a whole. Look at villains like Lich, Bellows, and the Diamonds. The heroes realize they are tougher and more dangerous than the foes they've encountered previously, but other than that, they treat them as just another threat. WOI, on the other hand, the characters know how out of place Dom is. Like, what the hell is this edgy, scary person doing in our silly little galaxy? It's like she's from a different show entirely, and the main four have no fucking idea how to deal with her. They are totally confused. All of their typical tactics are rendered ineffective, like Sylvia can't curb stomp her minions, Lord Hater is salty about how cool and edgy she is, Peepers envies her effectiveness, and Wander's silly antics can't do shit and he's a whole ass mood about it in the premiere. Hell, she then makes all the other villains look like chumps and totally breaks their will and egos. It's as if to say, this is what happens when you're silly and non-serious about your job. Lord Dominator is so out of place, but at the same time, right at home in the show she is a part of. This even comes full circle in the finale, where she is the one blindsided and baffled of how these goofy idiots were able to defeat someone like her. Like, it's really mind-boggling to think about how the crew was able to perform such a perfect balancing act with how they wrote her. And that balance of seriousness and silliness, to not just the villain, but the second season as a whole, is why Wander Over Yonder's serialization dominates other cartoons.